We're live? Okay, great. Well, let's open with a word of prayer. Holy and gracious God, I thank you for this evening. I ask God that you be with us as we look at your text this evening and look at conflict in the Holy Land. Lord, we ask that you open our minds that we may understand and open our eyes that we may see. We say these things in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. So we'll go over the document that I gave you in just a second, but if you have a Bible near you, which you all should, and you want to look it up, go to Romans chapter 13. Tonight's talk will be basically kind of a carryover from when we talked about the land of Israel. But in Romans 13, we're gonna kind of take two different looks, two different views of Romans 13 when it comes to the situation between Israel and Palestine. And whoever finds it first, tell everybody else what page it's on. That'd be great. 162? Okay, there we go, 162. And the version that I'm reading tonight is a little different than yours, so if you get lost, just listen to me, I guess. So we're going to read verses 1 through 7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So generally speaking, how do we sum up what we just kind of read there? Pay up, okay, all right. Okay, this weird thing that God has, and as Presbyterians, it's not too weird for us. We believe in election, right? So we think whoever God has put in power, whoever is in power is put there by God. That's a better way for me to say that, okay? And that is pretty okay for most of the time. Can you think of any times when you would question whether or not the person was the leader because God put them there, right? Not just in our country, right? But think about world history-wise. What's the easiest one to be like, nah? Hitler, right? Okay, it'd be hard for us to look at Hitler and say, respect Hitler because he is God's servant. That's a challenging statement for me, right? Stalin, I would have issues with that as well. Pol Pot, I mean, just all the terrible things that have happened in the 20th century that we're kind of looking back on now, 100 years or so later. It's hard to look at that and say that those are people that God put in to that office. But let's just hypothetically, let's say that that's the case, right? Is there any instance that you can think of, and we'll just stick with Hitler because, again, that's the easiest one to pick on because he was such an idiot. But is there anything that he did that was like worthy to be followed? Can you think of anything that he did? Took good care of his mother? Okay, so there's that. The mama's boy. Right. Okay, so from a German perspective, you have this person who is empowering you and saying that, just because we lost in World War I, we don't have to be the butt of every joke in Europe. We don't have to do all these things. And so, yeah, there was probably some warmth from some people that like that, right? Challenging would be what he did to some other neighboring countries, right? So Austria, they never really had a chance. They just became under his power. The Austrian government said, okay, yes, we'll go with you. And so then suddenly everybody that's Austrian now they have to follow under what Hitler says. And you could argue that Hitler had a decent feeding program, right? He did some decent things in making sure people ate. And I even feel weird saying that anything that he did was beneficial, but the highway system is probably something that still benefits Germans today. And anybody that's ever ridden in a Volkswagen, the people's wagon, the people's car, right? So some of those kinds of things, Mercedes and Volkswagen both were kind of really came into power when Hitler was there. And then Hugo Boss. Hugo Boss is who made the uniforms for the Nazis. Yeah. So, he did quite well throughout that, okay? So he empowered a bunch of Germans to do well. As a Christian, put yourself as a German Christian, 1938, and you find out that Hitler has decided to do something called the Kristallnacht, the breaking of glass, and start sending Polish Jews into a pogrom. That's what he's done with his power. As a Christian, how do we respond to that? Do you know what the Kristallnacht is? Everybody know that? Basically, they just went through entire Jewish portions of town, broke all the glass, kicked everybody out of their homes, broke all the glass in their homes. People died. Most people were were enslaved or put into a POW camp. It was pretty terrible. It was horrible. And that's really the beginning of what their final solution was towards the extermination of Jews. Okay? As a German Christian, that would be a difficult thing for me to support that leader. I think. I would hope that I would have a difficult time still supporting my national leader, right? And in Romans 13, we have a decent description of what it means to live in maybe a Christian land, or a land where you're able to be a Christian. But maybe there are differences of opinion between the government leaders and what Christianity actually is. There's never going to be a true Christian government, right? It's never going to be. We can't have that. But for some places, it's decent to be a Christian in the United States, right? I have no complaints about being a Christian here. Canada, Mexico, decent places to be Christians. Most of Europe, pretty safe to be a Christian, right? Africa gets a little hairy there. Asia, a little bit more scary, right? Russia, not always the greatest place to be a Christian. China, terrible place to be a Christian. North Korea, horrible place to be a Christian, right? But it's horrible to be any kind of religion in those places. It doesn't matter. It's horrible to be a Muslim in China. He's enslaving Muslims and trying to retrain them to no longer be Muslim, right? So we have these challenges of these world leaders. And they are, if we remember when we talked previously about how the Jews have a strict connection to the land, right? Remember that kind of argument that we made? That for the Jews, part of their identity is not just their religion, it's not just their ethnicity, there's also a land, right? And so we're doing everything after World War II, obviously. We're kind of looking at what Israel looks like post-World War II, and so that's part of this conversation that we have to have. There was not an Israel, there was not a nation named Israel after the first century of the Common Era. It stopped being called that. It started being called Palestine. I think I told you that. It's a weird translation from the Romans tried to say Philistine. They tried to give all the land to the Philistines, who were the known enemy of the Jews. They put a pi instead of a phi when they made those errors, and so it became Palestine. It should have been called Philistine. Anyway, we've not had an Israel prior to 1948 since just after Jesus died. Just didn't happen. There were biblical sites and there were names of towns that still existed, but as far as it being the land of Israel, it's just not the case. So after we go through the Holocaust And the UN and other countries say, hey, this is like this whole Zionism thing, this place where people can be safe to be a Jew, it kind of makes sense. Like we probably do need to like reconnect them with their land, right? And so we have mass immigration of Jewish people to the Middle East. That day for the Israelis is a day of declaration of independence. It's also a day for the Palestinians who live there. They call it Nakba Day. It's the day that they were overrun by the Jews. Okay, so there's never going to be a clean, clear, healthy conversation about what happens in Israel-Palestine without being able to say that when the Jews came in, people lost their homes. That's just a fact. They were previous tenants, mostly Palestinian people, some Jordanian people, some Egyptian people, some Turkish people, but most of the people that were there were Palestinian. And when that happened, when Israel was going to declare their independence and declare this land their own, many of the Muslim leaders of the day told those people that live there, for your own safety, leave. We'll defeat them, and then you can come home. That's not what happened. Israel miraculously won, and they gained their independence, and they claimed this is the land of our people now. It's always been the land of our people. We just weren't allowed to live there. Now we have the UN. We have the British Mandate of Palestine, which says that there has to be a place carved out for the Jewish people. That happened actually after World War I. And so that's the document that they used to form modern-day Israel. Okay? You can Google absolutely all of that. That's, if you want to learn more about that, very easy to find on the internet. So from 1948 on, how many of you are old enough to remember a country called Transjordan? Remember that? Okay, Transjordan was actually on a globe that I had growing up. That's the only reason I even remember it, right? So Transjordan is now the modern state of Jordan. But before Israel existed, it was called Transjordan because it went across the Jordan River. So what we now in modern times call the West Bank, it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. That territory used to belong to Jordan. So up until the War of 67, that's when Israel defeated Jordan and pushed Jordan off of that land, and they, from a military perspective, claimed the West Bank as part of an occupied territory. So even when Israel was established, that was never Palestinian land, it was Jordanian land. So today, 2022, you have Palestinian refugees who live in Jordan, have refugee status there. But when you hear things like, in order for this to make sense, we have to give the Palestinian people their land back. If you have to go back to the 67 borders, right? That's one of the things that Obama espoused, was we have to go back to the 67 borders. The 67 borders give all that land back to Jordan. They don't give anything to Palestine, right? And so it's very, very confusing. So how are we gonna give land to a set of people? The Palestinians also have not ever been given Jordanian citizenship. Some of them have a Jordanian passport, but that allows them to identify as Palestinian, but they're not citizens there. So we have this problem as Christians. We see that there are Christian Arabs that lived in this land of Israel. We have Jewish people that are moving into this area, and we have Arab Muslims that are there. Three major religions all come together kind of right there. That's a hotbed within, in and of itself. Say no more if you just say a Jew, an Arab, Christian, and a Muslim walk into a bar. Like, that sounds like something bad's going to happen, right? That's just tough. So part of what we have to understand and kind of get back to is Israel's desire to reclaim their ancestral home is 2,000 years removed, give or take, from what it actually was when it was their home, when it was a Roman province, right? When they lived there before and they had, the tetrarchy of Herod and things like that. All of those provinces were still under Roman rule. So even during Jesus' day, as much as the Jews would have said, yes, we have power, this is our land, they would have said this is our land, but they understood this occupier was there. Interestingly, for the last 3,000 years, that land has most often is always occupied. So there's 5 major groups of people that have kind of lived in that area, okay? So when you hear the word Persia in the Bible, you should think of the land of modern-day Iran, okay? That's where the Persians kind of were. They've been a power for a long, long time, right? The next thing is, and this was a little bit harder to understand, for me to describe to you actually, because I don't understand it all. The way that Syria and Iraq tie together has always kind of been like a seesaw. So if you have a very strong Syria, you have a very weak Iraq. If you have a strong Iraq, you have a very weak Syria. And a lot of that goes back to their ethnicities and the form of Islam that they worship and things like that as well. But they're never going to both be strong at the same time. So that is kind of almost like a crescent moon of an area in the Middle East that's either been under the power of Iraq or Babylon, Assyria, right? Those areas from Syria all the way down through Iraq, okay? The third superpower there historically has been, we now call it Turkey. It's been several different things, right? It was the Ottoman Empire. That was the basis of the Ottoman Empire for years and years and years. And prior to that, it was, for the most part, I would say, besides how the Greeks and Romans in Europe ruled that area of the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire was probably the strongest, I would argue, historically speaking. And so then you have Europe with the Greek and Roman influence on this area, and then you have Egypt over to the left of the Holy Land, okay? One thing that, and as Presbyterians, one thing that I can always agree with my brothers and sisters who are on the opposite side of this argument, okay? So there's 2 sides to this within FPCSA. The one thing that we usually typically agree upon is this area has always been an occupied area. Even when Israel was fighting it biblically, even when David was a Bethlehemite, like it's always been at war, right? We had to, when the Israelites came in, they said we have to do what? What do the Israelites have to do? Who do they have to push out? The Canaanites. We have to go into the land. This is the land that God promised us, the land of the Canaanites. We have to push them out, right? Think about blowing that trumpet, the horn, as they walked around the city, right? When they tried to tear down Jericho. 7 days we're going to march around this thing blowing our horns, right? Jericho, West Bank. Okay? So there's a great deal of history, biblical history, and stuff that we know outside of the Bible about this area. So why does somebody want this little dusty, sandy piece of soil? Why do you think? Water, access to the Med, access to the Jordan, right? The other main reason is religion. You have the 3 monotheistic religions are all born, essentially, or have some connection in Israel. So in Jerusalem itself, where Muhammad ascended into heaven, is within eye distance of the Wailing Wall. You could be standing next to one and look and almost see the other one, the Golden Dome. Very, very close to each other. Anytime that you hear stuff on the news about it's popped off in the West Bank again, or it's popped off in Jerusalem, it's usually because Israel has decided to block access to the Muslims' ability to go worship. Why can I not think of the name of that temple right now? Dome of the Rock, sorry, gosh. Lord have mercy on my soul. Because of security issues, okay? Or at least that's what Israel will say, well, it's a security issue, we have to limit who can come in, da-da-da-da. That makes everybody mad, and a fight erupts, okay? That's been going on. The whole time life has lived there. It has never been like fully 100% conquered by anybody. Ottomans could argue possibly, Romans possibly, but for the most part, it's always been infighting. There's never been really a time of true peace there. So when you look at that, you have, our Holy Land where Christ was crucified. You have Judaism where King David builds his temple. More importantly, King Solomon's temple was the temple that was the most majestic, right? And then the third temple will be built again someday, we think, right? But the second temple stuff that's going on, the second temple when Jesus was there, was the temple that was built after their exile to Babylon, okay? So it wasn't Solomon's temple, it was the Babylonian temple. And every time that a new conquering force comes in, remember, back to the Bible, conquering force is deemed correct by whom? By God, okay? So if you're a Christian and you're reading this book and you hear Rome has come in and sacked Jerusalem, or they've burned down the temple, and that's an act of God, then what must our opinion then be? Well, God must hate the Jews. That must be what's going on. God must hate the Jews. So as a German Christian, it's very easy to jump to God must hate the Jews. You may not be in line with Hitler, but it may be a lot easier for you to just say, well, he is appointed by God, right? Now, what I think Paul meant was more of the Davidic line of leadership, of kingship, how God did actually select from the tribes of Israel who would be king, right? But even after Solomon, so you have Saul, David, Solomon, and after Solomon, what happens? Split in the kingdom. The kingdom has never been joined back together again. So they made it through 3 kings before they could not stand each other as a race of people, right? And so that's how we also kind of get the story of the Samaritans, or Jews that had been broken off, after the Babylonian stuff. So where do we as Christians now in the 21st century, where do we reconcile ourselves to Romans 13? How can you make Romans 13 make sense for us right now? Let me read the whole thing. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath to the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. To whom honor is owed, sorry. Okay, there's an excellent question, right? Could you argue that the way Hitler ruled was an unjust rule? Could you argue that? Right? That's the easiest thing to say. The Bible may be correct, but Hitler usurped authority, there's all kinds of, he's ruling unjustly, okay? Another place where this happened is in South Africa, okay? So in South Africa, what's the story of South Africa? Apartheid, okay? So white Dutch settlers in the minority have all the power, and the local Africans who, in their native land, weren't allowed to do anything. Couldn't hold power. They had to cross the street. If a white person was walking, you couldn't be on the same sidewalk as them. I mean, horrific rules. Now, people died not as badly as they did in Germany, but it was horrific, right? And in my childhood, it basically ended. Like in the 80s, that's when it all kind of came to fruition that this is not a good thing. And so there was a document that was written. It was called the Kairos document, 75 pages long or something like that. The Kairos document, Kairos. So that's a word, it's a Greek word that means God's special timing. So in their reasoning, they said, hey, this is God's timing. What's happening in South Africa is not right. We should overturn this. And the world said what? We agree. So we're going to boycott South Africa until they change their ways, until the native people have equality with the Dutch settlers. Okay? Essentially what happened. Some people that really, really, really hate the Jews said, aha, I've got it. We'll have Kairos Palestine. It's the same thing that happened in South Africa. The Israelis, these new people, are colonists. They're colonizing our land. And so we're going to say they have no right to this land whatsoever. We're going to say it's God's justice. And we're going to say Romans 13 points us to the fact that the Israeli government is acting outside God's plan, because there's not a Christian nation happening. It's going to be a Jewish nation happening. And that's not right. Palestinians at the time were Christian. Most Palestinians today are Muslim, but at the time when all this was kind of happening, there was a decent population of Christians that lived there. So they wrote this document that I handed out to you tonight. And in this document, they say things. You'll notice there's nothing about a Jew listed here, right? But it's all about how justice and how injustice is happening. This is a cry of hope. Well, we reach out with love and prayer and faith in God. You all have to do something. And so when this happened, it was pretty much coincided with the first Intifada. Do you all know what the Intifada is? So from 1987 until 1993, probably every night on nightly news, you saw INTIFADA. FADA. Intifada. So that happened pretty much the end of the late 80s until the beginning of the early 90s. Part of that, if you recall, in 93 when we went to 93, 92. When did we invade Iraq? 91. Was that in 91 that we invaded Iraq? Does that sound right? Anyway, there was bombing going on in Tel Aviv, right? So they kind of included the Intifada, but the Intifada was that the Palestinian people were going to push the Israelis into the sea. Their motto became, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And so there were massive attacks on Israel from the West Bank and from Gaza that lasted 8 years or so, okay? Didn't work. That was under the leadership of a guy named Yasser Arafat. Probably remember him, right? 93, the reason it's important to talk about 93, those were the Oslo Accords. What happened with the Oslo Accords? Anybody? Clinton was able to get Israel to give back most of, I think all of Gaza, most of the West Bank, splitting Jerusalem. Arafat had to make a few, consolation prize things. Everybody in Israel signed off on it. Guess who didn't sign off on it? Palestinians. Palestinian Authority did not sign off on it. And so you have a little bit of a break from 93 till about 2000. From 2000 to 2005 is what they call the Second Intifada, which was, again, attacks at bus stops, the stabbings of police officers, things you see on the news all the time. Palestinians attacking Israelis. And Israel is not without sin. As much as I love them and think they have a right to exist, Israel is not without sin. One of the challenging things that happens, and you'll hear it on the news all the time, is they've bombed a school, or they've bombed a hospital, they've bombed this, or they bombed that. Why are they doing that? Do you know? because that's where the daggone missiles are, right? But it's still terrible, right, that's what they're bombing. So it's a horrific thing, and Israel will boldly tell you, we drop pamphlets before we drop bombs, and we tell people leave. Great, that's awesome. Guess what Hamas specifically doesn't allow civilians to do? Leave. So they get blown to bits, and then that makes headline news. Look how evil Israel is. They bombed our school. People died on both sides of that conflict. Al-Aqsa, that's what I was trying to think of. Al-Aqsa Mosque. Gosh. The Golden Dome is yes, but the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the true name for that place. So anyway, those things happen after 2006. FPCSA makes a statement that we need to be part of a movement called BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction. Meaning we're going to hold Israel accountable for all the atrocities that are happening. It's 100% Israel's fault. Palestinians are just being oppressed. And so we voted at our General Assembly in 2006 to support the BDS movement. It came out of nowhere. Everybody was kind of shocked. It wasn't one of those things. There wasn't a group that I'm a part of now. The reason we exist is because of the 2006 General Assembly, because we were like, holy crap, what just happened? Like, oh my gosh, we just kind of did an anti-Semitic thing. We said we're gonna boycott Israel. We're gonna divest all of our money from companies that are doing business in Israel. We think that the American government should sanction Israel until they give the land back. And so I would ask the question, to whom should the land be given back? The Ottomans? The Persians? The Jordanians? Pick one, right? They've all been there. Rome literally burned Jerusalem to the ground. I mean, that's just accepted part of history. So does that change the fact that your homeland, right, your homeland that you read about in your text, that your parents, when you celebrate the high holy days, when your grandparents tell you stories about how they fought and they want to go back to this place where where you're free to be a Jew, nobody's going to persecute us. When you hear those tales over and over and over again, when you sit with a family in mourning and you think about the hope and the prayer of being able to be rejoined with them someday in Jerusalem, right? And so for somebody to tell you, no, that's not, you don't get to do that. It's not your land. It's not your land at all. You don't get to have that. We want it just to be Palestinian. So at PCUSA, what we decided to do, we started a group called Presbyterians for Middle East Peace, and we said, we think we need to support a two-state solution. We agree that Palestinians need a homeland. They do. They absolutely have a right to self-determination, as do the Kurds, as do so many other groups in the world, right? But so does Israel. Israel has a right to have their own place to live as well. And it's confusing and it's hard and it's difficult and challenging, but I think our work as Christians is to do something about working towards making this be a peaceful thing that happens rather than what we've kind of done the last decade and a half as a denomination. So if you want to look up BDS, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, it's a group of people who are on record being very blatant anti-Semites, who from time to time have also espoused using violence if necessary to kill Jews, right? And so we somehow bought into that. In 2014, we published a document called Zionism Unsettled. It was about an 80-page document. It was in response to what had happened at the 2012 General Assembly, which was we need to look at, this happened in Pittsburgh, actually, the 2012 General Assembly in Pittsburgh. They adopted a saying that we need to invest in peace, not divest, right? And so for 2 years, Our denomination spent millions of dollars sending people to Israel to find out how we can invest in peacemaking between Palestinians and Israelis. What happened is they came back with this document called Zionism Unsettled, which means Zionism is in and of itself racism. It's racist against anything that's not Jewish. And we should never support Zionists. We should never be supportive of anyone who's in favor of Zionism, because if you were to, I'm not even exaggerating when I tell you what I'm going to tell you next. If you were to take DNA samples of modern day Jews, they would not match Middle Eastern DNA. They would match European DNA. The people that match Middle Eastern DNA most often are Palestinians. Okay? Now, why is that? What's that? That's exactly what it is. That is precisely what it is, right? Yes. Right. So in Judaism, how is the faith passed down from generation to generation? Do you know who does that? The mother. Okay? If we can agree with history that the Jews were sent all over God's green earth, literally, in the diaspora under Roman occupation. They were taken as slaves. They were taken as servants. Some were allowed to live and be together as families and things like that. But if you're taken and your faith is a woman and you've been against your will brought into this place, right? Yes, you're going to have, the first generation still has a little bit of Middle Eastern in them, right? There's trace Middle Eastern in the Jews, but there's a huge population of Jewish people, Ashkenazi Jews specifically, that are from Central Europe, and then the Sephardi Jews are mostly from Spain, and they have Spanish DNA. Again, all because of the diaspora. Meanwhile, any Arab really has kind of stayed on that Arabian Peninsula, and so their DNA is, yes, there's European blood that's mixed in there with there as well, but most of the time, yes, it's true, okay? So they would argue, and I have one of my dearest friends as a Presbyterian minister, God rest his soul. He and I could not see eye to eye on this. He was a firm believer that was proof enough that Israel should not exist, that God has essentially damned them because they have no genealogical tie back to the land, right? And you can argue with these folks till you're blue in the face; they're never going to see it differently than that. And that's the group of folks that have come up with this Kairos document. It's who wrote Zionism Unsettled. They wrote another document in 2018 that complimented Hamas on their humanitarian treatment of civilians. And they talked about how the Israeli people, Israelis and Jews all over the world, have stolen the culture of the Middle East by having the audacity to say that hummus is an Israeli food. My hand to Jesus, that is in a FPCSA document. So in committee in 2018 in St. Louis, I got up to speak and I said, we only really need to know one thing. The leadership of FPCSA, as far as I'm concerned, wants us to know that Hamas is good and hummus is bad. And I'm pretty sure you can recognize that those two are not mutually exclusive. Like, if you're thinking that Hamas, of all places, of all leaders in the world, Hamas is a humanitarian group? Are you kidding me? It makes my blood boil. What does Hamas do if you're a homosexual man? I'll tell you. They'll take you up to the top of a roof of a hotel, and if you're lucky, they'll slit your throat. You're probably not going to be lucky. They're going to fling you off that hotel and take pictures of your body and let your body be dragged through town. And we, as the most liberal denomination in the U.S., pick that. And it blows my mind. It absolutely blows my mind. And so I'm sorry, I'm sweaty, I'm hot, I'm like fidgety, like this fires me up. Like it really, I apologize. I talked to three of my friends this week about this, and I said, tell me what you think when you think the FPCSA made this switch. And they all three gave me different answers, which is okay, because that's That's what we do. We all disagree. But really, if you boil it down, I think once we decided that BDS was the social justice movement of the day, and we hitched our wagon to BDS. And even though the world has shown that BDS is one of the most hate-filled groups of people on earth, they started what's called the electronic intifada. Now remember the word intifada, right? It's a Palestinian uprising where they're okay killing Jews. That's essentially the definition of intifada. So the electric intifada is put as much hate into Twitter and Facebook and Instagram on the internet, put it out as much as you can about the Jews. This past weekend, if you watch the news, what did Kanye West do? Basically blamed Jews for everything that's wrong with the earth, right? That's what Hitler did. Unfortunately, Martin Luther did some of that stuff. That's why Hitler was able to use Martin Luther's words during World War II to convince some of the Lutheran Christians that he was okay doing this stuff. So this is all around us. Well, I care about being a Presbyterian minister. It matters a lot to me. I probably shouldn't be proud of, but I'm proud of passing ordination exams and getting to the place where I can be a Presbyterian minister. I wanted this. I grew up Baptist. You'll have heard me say that 1,000 times. You'll hear me say it 1,000 more. I picked this mess, right? And so part of what my passion behind all this is, I cannot believe, as socially minded people as we are, that this is the direction that we've chosen to go, as a denomination. And to call what's happening in Israel apartheid is just a sin. I mean, you have Arab Muslims on the Supreme Court in Israel. You have Arab Druze, who we've not even mentioned them yet. How many of y'all know what a Druze is? That's a break off of Islam, okay? They're elected to the Knesset in Israel. It is not just run by Jewish people. It is not just Jews that run Israel. Yet our denomination has stamped it and said, well, those aren't real Arabs. I guess. They're somehow brainwashed by the Jews. And I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but that's really what it kind of boils down to. And why do we do that? The main reason is social justice, but the part two to that is we put millions of dollars into starting schools all across North Africa and in the Middle East. So the American University of Cairo, the American University of I'll get there in a minute. It's in Lebanon. The capital of Lebanon is Beirut. American University in Beirut, and the American University in, I can't remember where it is in Syria. Okay, those are all Presbyterian universities. We started all of those. Okay, so our friendship back at the turn of the 20th century was getting Christian education to the Middle East. That was our goal as a denomination. And so we won't let go of that. At the time, we were trying to convert Muslims. We've long since stopped doing that. But because of that, because of how we kind of got in agreement with them, back then we kind of have sided with the Muslim Arab population instead of looking at Judaism. And it's sad to me because I think I've said this maybe the first or second week, I can't remember. Like our existence as Christians really comes through Judaism. Judaism was the mother that bore Christianity, right? I mean, that's how we got this faith. We mimic our worship on Sunday mornings is very similar to how Jewish people worship. We read Psalms or sing songs. We have, I talk about a text from the Bible. Like we got all that stuff from the Jewish people. That's how Jesus taught his disciples to be. One of my friends at that same General Assembly that I spoke about Hamas and hummus being bad, he got up on the floor of General Assembly and he said, for the love of God, Jesus was a Jew. But to them, Jesus was a Palestinian. And they don't want to let that die. And so it's tough to be a Presbyterian minister right now. And when my friends say, why are you still there? Why are you still in that denomination? My only answer is, I think it's salvageable. I think it's salvageable somehow. But I also feel like it's an uphill battle, right? And by quitting's easy. I could leave tomorrow. I could become a different kind of minister tomorrow if I wanted to, right? But that feels tough to me. And so our ship is sinking. I mean, the Titanic has been headed underwater for a while. At the next General Assembly, I would venture a guess and say we'll be under 100 or under 1 million members for the first time since our denomination has existed. We're right above it right now. We're like 1,100,000 or something like that. And it's a steady decline. Basically, every 2 years we lose about 300,000 members. So we're gonna. I mean, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be like pouty Polly here. Like I don't want to be that. But like, that'll fix itself, right? The problem that I see is how many of you before I came here as your pastor thought anything about Presbyterians and Israel and the Middle East and Palestinians? Maybe Kathy, maybe Holly. Okay. Probably didn't hear anything. I mean, you don't, right? You don't know. And that's the sad part is, I would venture a guess, the majority of Presbyterians in pews have no idea that is what we're doing, right? No clue. And some other Presbyterians would be like, why should we care what happens in Israel? What, that has nothing to do? I mean, really, is this helping St. Albans, First Presbyterian Church of St. Albans in any way, shape, or form? You're getting educated, but that's about the extent of it, right? Like, we're not changing the world by having this conversation. But if our job as Christians is to be the ambassador of peace in the world, if we are supposed to take Christ-like love into the world, and stuff like this happens, and we sit on it, that's our sin, right? And it's sad that so many Presbyterian ministers don't want to have this kind of conversation because they're afraid how their church would react or whatever, right? Yes. Yes. Well, so are you. Anybody that's an elder is, yes, right.
But in effect, pastors are the ones that are going to make the major decisions. So if they discuss that General Assembly decision to their constituents, their congregations, that probably would be called as enough. That would raise awareness to it, and their congregations probably would be not as in alignment with it as
I agree.
a lot of them do. And so that's something that's very bold that a pastor will stand up and say this is what it is.
Right.
Either side you're on,
I could be the other way.
you could, well, in the position you are, you're vulnerable in that position that there may be folks in this church that think
Sure.
different.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the hard part. I mean, one of my dearest friends in the denomination is hanging 10 on the other side of the surfboard, right? And I love him to death. I love him. And we cannot get together on this one at all. I'm still thankful that I can call him a friend because most of the time, once you make a statement, as I have made, you are blackballed. I mean, basically, I'm akin to the Tulsi Gabbard of the Democratic Party, right? I did not follow the marching orders of the party, and now I'm out, right? I mean, that's kind of how that works, right? So people that don't speak to you at General Assembly, that you've been on a committee with in another presbytery, because you've made a name for yourself as somebody that supports Israel, right? Does anything about that sound Christian, right? Is there nothing about that is Christian, right? And you know, again, Israel has to stop doing some of the junk that they do, right? What they're doing right now in the West Bank, I have issues with it because they're sending the most Orthodox Jews who are going to have the largest families. That's who they're sending into the West Bank most of the time to create a bigger mass of people there, right? They're harder to move when you've got family ties. I think that's not a good thing. I think that's a bad thing. I think that does not bode well for Israel having fans anyplace else in the world, right? But no, they're not forced. There's an encouraging. You're encouraged to do that, right? Well, of course, yeah, right, yeah. And so the other thing I'll say is that used to happen in Gaza as well, but Israel has not been in Gaza since 2005. They pulled every settlement out of Gaza in 2005. Not been back. Okay. What's that? They have isolated it, right? And that's one of the other sins at the international level. There's a blockade. Israel has a blockade of stuff coming into Gaza, right? From an American perspective, I'm going to shut up because I just realized what time it is. From an American perspective, billions of our tax dollars have gone to Palestine to the tune of about $8 billion since '98 to help with water, housing, food, clothing, da-da-da-da-da. Yet, Palestinian people still living in poverty. They don't have jobs. Where'd that money go? Mahmoud Abbas is where it went, who has not called for an election in the West Bank for 16 years, something like that. He just keeps renewing his presidency. So there's a lot of junk that's happening around this package. But what I want us to do as Christians is to weigh and measure what would Christ have us do in this situation. And I don't see Christ saying you pick one side or the other, right? That's the hot and the cold argument of Revelation, but that's about salvation. That's not about how we are on earth. How we are on earth is, what did Jesus teach us? Love your neighbor. Love your neighbor, right? I don't feel a lot of love in some of the stuff that comes out. It's way beyond what Reformed theology is, right? I mean, it's way beyond that. Correct.
Their side of the issues that you may or may not agree on, and yet with love you can still have a relationship and not be in agreement.
And here's the greatest part about that, Kathy. If we actually were in a relationship with people on both sides of that conflict, we could then, hopefully, because we have a relationship, speak hard truths to them and say, Palestinians, you got to stop sending Molotov cocktails at kindergarten playgrounds. And Israel, you got to stop sending 57 member families into the West Bank to colonize it. You got to stop. Like, that's where we need to be. Saying one side's right and the other side's wrong just feels so un-Christian to me. I don't see any place in the Bible, apart from Romans 13, where there's an acknowledgement that that whatever lines we demarcate is what we're always supposed to be, right?
I know we're out of time, but I want to know what's the context of chapter 13, this first part of chapter 13, and Paul saying, because Paul probably rolls over in his grave on a regular basis.
Every time he's quoted, sure, yep.
The gravity that we put on his letters. They're letters.
Right.
Specific people.
That's a valid point, and it's an excellent point. We'll close with that then. So the context of how Paul is writing this letter, remember, this is to a group of Christians in Rome that are Gentile converts to Christianity and then Jewish, they cease being Jewish, right? So part of the argument was, so to whom do we belong? Are we Roman? Are we not Israeli? They didn't have that word back then. Do we belong to Israel? Do we belong, where do we belong? Who do we pay? It's the same thing that Jesus said when he asked to see the coin. Whose picture's on the coin? Give to Caesar what is Caesar and to God what is God's, right? Same general concept. If you live in a place, now, I don't like paying taxes. I'm just going to admit that to you. Right? I don't like paying taxes. But Jesus says you need to be an abiding citizen by the law. I don't think that means you always have to do unjust. We can talk about this maybe next week. That Christians are not necessarily called to practice unrighteous laws, right? I think that's where we can argue that that's probably not something that Jesus would ever ask us to do. However, that context is this is how you get along. You no longer pick sides. Your citizenship is much larger than the land where you live. Your citizenship is in heaven. You just happen to be planted on earth for a little while. So while you're there, pay your blooming taxes. That's Shakespeare, isn't it? I don't know who said win in Rome. I don't know. Maybe. He said, is that the basis for win in Rome? Okay, it's 7:32, so let's close in prayer. Holy and gracious God, we thank you again for this day that you've given us. Thank you, Lord, for this time to come together and study. Lord, help us understand and Lord, have us contemplate how you would use us. Lord, we ask that you would create a space within us that is a space for peacemaking instead of conflict making. We pray, Lord, that in our daily lives that we can love our neighbors here, that we can be an example of what it means to love. And God, also ask that you keep us safe until we meet again, either here or your glorious kingdom come. All this we say in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.